Wally.
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 Eve. Eve. Eve.
Don't worry, guys. Wally is not going to present this session.
Oh.
But welcome to automating microapps deployments with CI/CD in Azure DevOps. It is an honor to be here at Citrix Conference 2020 presenting about this topic, and hopefully we're going to learn a lot today. So let's first define the goal of this presentation, because we want to widen your perspective how to manage and maintain your Citrix microapps using Azure DevOps. So today we're going to cover some basic about automation, but also the microapp structure and how you can leverage Azure DevOps to maintain those. I have to add a little bit of a disclaimer here because we run into some limitations of the APIs on the Citrix side. So it's not fully there yet, but at least give you some perspective on how to do it, and at least prepare for in the future. So a small disclaimer. But let's first introduce myself. My name is Ververs-Bijkerk, so I'm a technical evangelist working at Rawworks. Quite difficult name, Rawworks. So I'm a Citrix CTP, and I'm working as a consultant, focusing on helping our customers. And that can be from basic implementations of VDI solutions, but also automation, performance testing, and even microapps. And I'm here with the man that can walk on Wi-Fi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction, Ryan. So my name is Eltjo van Gulik, and coincidentally, I also work for Rawworks. That means that I am a colleague of Ryan. And at Rawworks, I am the principal consultant for the workspace domain. And the workspace domain covers everything around the desktop, which also includes microapps.
Interesting.
And by the way, I'm also Citrix CTP. Almost forgot that.
Nice fact, though.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about our company because we're kind of special breed. Now, I have to mention that we have the honor that we are the best certified micro experts within the Netherlands, but I also think even in Europe.
Yeah, I think we are. Yeah.
It is. But we focus on helping our customers using the intelligent workspace, and we call that our mission 1. So what we do is leverage technologies like Citrix microapps to make our customers work smart. Now we have a lot of people working for us, and we're in a quite unique positions because we have a lot of consultants that can implement Citrix solutions from the traditional CVAT, so the desktop publishing, towards microapps. But we also have like developer expertise. So we cover a wide spectrum of expertise within the company, which makes us at least in a unique position. So I want to emphasize that this is going to be a sneak peek also in a part of our services that we offer towards the customers. So we don't often too much really open into details of everything that we do. But this is for you guys a really unique opportunity, at least how we think about microapps and some of our approaches towards the microapps. So
yeah, in automation in general, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we have defined the following agenda. So first we want to talk a little bit about the value of automation, because it's really important to have some understanding on that. Then we're going to cover microapps by code. So it's the different approach of the microapps. So we do expect that you have at least a little bit of microapp knowledge already. Then we're going to cover the from build to release. And finally, we're going to end up with the next steps for you, but also for Citrix.
Sounds like an interesting agenda, Ryan.
It is. It's going to be packed because I've got a lot of slides.
So, yeah. So without further ado, let's kick things off with talking a little bit about the value of automation. And in that light, with everything moving to the cloud, our perspective on all these things is changing as well, especially regarding the applications that we consume, not only as consumers, but also in corporate environments. We have very high expectations when it comes to availability. And take a service like Netflix, for instance. It is our expectation that Netflix is up 24/7 without any disruptions. But we also expect that the scale needs to be right. If we look at the example of Netflix again, we expect Netflix to size its cloud so that everyone is able to stream whatever they want every time in the highest quality possible. But Netflix started out pretty small, but now is almost a household name for anything, and any household can have access to Netflix in one way or another. But the same holds true in a smaller scale as well. If you think of your own VDI environment, Citrix now has the Citrix. Yeah. Okay, but the same holds true in a smaller scale as well. Think of your VDI environment. Citrix has auto-scale technology, which you can use to scale your environment up and down depending on the need. And lastly, the cloud really changed our perspective when it comes to agility. We expect always to get the latest and greatest, and that new functionality is added constantly while bugs are solved as soon as possible. And that is also something we need to realize when we are creating Microapp for our customers as well. So, why do we need automation? Well, we can use automation to optimize internal resources, enable businesses to scale, and to ensure consistency in the customer experience. Again, microapps are a prime example for this. With microapps, we can tick all these three boxes. So now that we know why we want to automate, we need to ask ourselves, what do we want to automate? And this is actually a very business-specific question, you know. Regarding microapps, we can start with the low-scale and repetitive tasks. For instance, for one company, it might be very beneficial to automate the way that PTOs are requested, but for another company, that might not bring any value to the business. Lastly, to complete the trinity, we need to think of how we want to automate. And that is an easy answer with Citrix Microapps, of course. But all jokes aside, you always need to keep the bigger picture in mind, but it is our thinking that you need to start out small instead of too big. So, well, defined or thinking as code is really the new way of thinking nowadays. And from our perspective, as being more consultants than programmers, everything started to be defined as code. Think of infrastructure as code. And all these trends that we as Citrix consultants see emerging are now, but even more so for in the future. And DevOps issue, if you look at it, DevOps is really the way to go here. With DevOps, which actually just a set of practices that combines the software development, the dev side, and our traditional IT operations, the ops side. And this is exactly what we mean with the new hybrid roles between being a full-on programmer and being a consultant in the operation. So this means that leveraging DevOps, we can provide continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is completely in line with the faster release cycles that we expect nowadays. And a prime example of DevOps is Microsoft adopting Azure DevOps, which is actually a toolset of modern development services within Azure. And services like that include, for instance, the Azure boards, which are Kanban boards, pipelines, and their own repository service as such.
Cool. So thank you for that introduction. So as we have learned from Eltjo, it's important to at least use an agile approach to deliver, in this case, the microapps. But in order to continue with that, it's an important first step is to apply some best practices using Git. Now, it is important, as this states also in the first sentence, don't commit to generated files. This is one of the best practices, of the many best practices that you can find on the internet. But this really applies also towards microapps. And you need to make sure we only commit files that are editable, and that can see the differences, at least in text. Another strategy that I personally really believe is using a Git flow strategy. So Git flow uses branching to do releases, development, and staging. And I really can recommend at least to apply a Git flow strategy when also maintaining your microapps within the versioning. Another thing is the log branches. You need to make sure that you separate your production environment from the development environment. And also in Azure DevOps, you can leverage at least the Git log branches to ensure nobody can just commit something in your production branch, and you need to at least make your changes using a pull request. But and a thing that we all hate, and I have to admit it to myself, that's documentation. But when using Git, and especially also in Azure DevOps, you can use the MD, so the Markdown languages. It's similar as GitHub, but use to document your microapps and to share at least some information on what it's doing, so others can also benefit from that. Now, with that in mind, if we look at the microapp structure, and especially when you export also a microapp, you will get a map file. But this map file is basically just an archive containing separate files. So as we have learned also from the best practices from Git, we need to ensure that once we commit a microapp within Git, extract that map file towards readable files. Now there are a couple files here. You can see we have a metadata JSON, we have a file SEP, then we have a number, an I18N. I'm not really sure what it stands for, but it contains at least a language file, and this case is an EN. I think it stands for English, and this is also in JSON.
Yep.
Now, if we look at in this example, I just opened the map file using 7-zip, and you can see here that it's the same structure applies when opening the map file. So it's just an extractable compressed file where the extension has been changed from a zip towards map. Now, when we go into the details, and there can be a lot of details in these files, depending on the size of your microapp, of course. But the metadata contains some, as you expect, metadata. It makes sense, right? So this contains some basic information of your microapp. It contains a unique ID, your title. It has some styling thing. You have your icon URL, which is also shown in the web interface for the admin part, but also for the user. But you can also here see that the languages is listed, so it can be one or multiple languages. And the most important ones are the apps, and these are the integrations or the micro apps within the integration itself. Now, if we go to the file SEP file, it's really strange, the file SEP file, yeah. But this is the file that really contains all the logic of your micro app. So here you can also see that there are, it's a JSON format, by the way. So in this example, I've added the extension to JSON for the formatting, but you can just open it with your editor. But here you can see that there are multiple applications with app versions defined in this entire structure. Now, please note, this is a lot of lines. Yeah. It's, in this case, 2,600 lines. So it's not really, that really readable. But this is contains all the logic of the Microapps app itself that's available. Now here you can also see a specific app. This contains also a unique identifier with some actions. And you can also see here that there on line 379, you have components. And in this component, you have a typed text input. And this is just similar as what you have within the web interface, the text input field, but then it's specified in code. As you can see right here. So all the values that are here for the text input for first name, for last name, department, the drop downs, everything is specified in this specific JSON file. Now the last one is the en.json, which is basically the language file. And here you see a similar pattern. You have all unique identifiers, and the first identifier is the microapp itself. And then you have the translations for all the various input fields, what we just seen in the form, in the builder. So this file is used for translation. So you can also add multiple languages.
Yeah, the thing is, I haven't seen any GUI options to add multiple languages to the microapps, by the way, or the integrations. But at least Citrix has made sure that we could use multi-language support if we wanted.
That's a very interesting fact. Maybe we can already add multiple languages if we use code.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's interesting.
Yep.
Who's going to challenge us and try it? I dare you. Okay, now, so let's talk about exporting.
Yeah, so if we want to automate anything with microapps, the first step we need to do is start by exporting the microapps, or at least actually the integration with or without the microapps. And we can do that in the GUI. As we can see here, we can select an integration and we can export the integration, or we can export an integration, a specific microapp. Yep, as we can see here. So here
this is exporting the integration itself, and
yep.
This is exporting the microapp. So there's two different options, at least in the GUI, that you can leverage towards the exporting the information.
Yep. And the same holds true if you want to use code to export it. If you want to export a integration, Citrix calls that a bundle in the API. So with the DevOps mentality in mind, the preferred method should be to use automation to export the integration of the microapps. And Citrix has a couple of APIs that we can leverage to do so. But there we found a couple of caveats with using this this method at the moment. When we worked with this, we saw that when we used the Citrix APIs to export the integrations, the metadata.json file was missing.
It is there, but it's empty.
Yeah, it contains null. It's empty. And the model configuration section in the file.sep file is missing. And that is probably because the missing information in the meta.json file. So we reported these findings back to Citrix, and hopefully they can fix that on very short notice.
I also want to add, when leveraging at least the API, you need to authenticate on the towards the backend. So we have also presented another session. It's the Clash of the Titans Python versus PowerShell, where we explain how you can authenticate towards Citrix. I really can recommend also to look in that session and see how you at least can authenticate towards the Citrix APIs. But please keep that in mind when leveraging the API. You need to be authenticated using Citrix Cloud.
Yeah. So for your convenience, Ryan and I, and when I say Ryan and I mean Ryan, created a script to compile the microapps again. And what that script will do, that script will put everything back together again. It will validate the metadata, it will take all the files, it will generate a zip file, and it will rename the zip file back with the map extension. But please note that this is a very rudimentary script at the moment. If you look at line 47, for instance, you can see that we check and validate the metadata, but the only check we do is to check that the vendor is Citrix, nothing more. So please feel free to extend or approve on this script. And behind the QR code over there, there's actually a link to the GitHub repository where you can find the script that Ryan created.
Yeah, so please feel free to contribute to this part. So the basic idea is at least to combine everything back together, as we have learned that we need to extract the microapp and put it in Git for the versioning.
Talking about community and working together. And also other suggestion for us is that you could please join the application as code Slack channel. And in that Slack channel, you can discuss everything microapp related with like-minded peers like Ryan and myself, and even others from Rawworks and other companies as well.
Yeah, so I recommend to go there. And if you have any comments or feedback and you don't want to code yourself, please share it also in the Slack channel, because we can use that as feedback at least to further enhance the script or maybe make other scripts.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go to the next step. In order to deliver the microapp, we need to compile what we just learned from the script and put it in a pipeline. Otherwise, and we're talking about CI/CD using Azure DevOps, then we also need to use Azure DevOps, of course. So in this example, I'm going to take, it makes sense. But I'm going to take you through how to create the pipeline itself. So in this example, we're going to create a pipeline called the compile Citrix Microapps. Now, as a best practice, I already have put my microapp towards the Git repository. Please note I used just the master because it's an example, so I didn't apply all the best practices I just talked about. But this is just a demo for your convenience and purposes. But usually you need to make a separate branch for your functionality, of course, if we just learned. But within this repository, I have a folder that contains the microapps, and the microapps are in a separate folder or a dedicated folder using the structure that we just have learned. So it contains the metadata JSON, the files app, and also the language translation. Now, I have a huge preference for using the YAML-based pipelines. And the reason that I have a huge preference, because it's defined by code. It's also in a repository, as you can see in the compile.yaml in the pipelines folder, is a text of a YAML-based file for your pipeline, which is version managed. So if you create a pipeline, don't use the legacy editor, use the new one. It's just the way to go from my perspective. And
but Microsoft just only recently added that functionality for the YAML-based pipelines, right?
Yeah, it's I'm not sure when it's added, but I'm using Azure DevOps for quite a while now, and I think a couple of years ago it's added. But you can still have the classic editor. But I also know that for example for the releases within the pipelines, you don't have the YAML based release pipelines yet, okay. Which is a bummer. But yeah, Microsoft also needs to do it in small iterations, right?
Yeah,
Agility.
you need to start up the game.
Yeah. So for those that are familiar already with Azure DevOps and also with the YAML-based pipelines, this is an easy step. But for those who don't know Azure pipelines, I really can recommend to leverage at least the UI within Azure DevOps and use the assistant, because that will help you creating a YAML-based pipelines. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to get all the context and the syntax correct. Now let's break down this specific pipeline. First, we have the top part, and that contains the trigger. And the trigger is the what's going to be triggering the pipeline itself. So any change that is made towards the master will trigger this specific pipeline. You also have the ability to add multiple branches in for this pipeline. Now we can specify a name, and this is just a name for your inconvenience or your convenience. I have to say, not inconvenience, for your convenience. Just what is shown in the user interface. Just a name that's used for styling, and you can also add like build numbers or a compile number, whatever you like. Now, an important part is the pool. And in this case, I'm using an Azure DevOps pool. This is a pool that Azure DevOps has available. And they have multiple variances. By default, when you create a starter pipeline, it specifies a Ubuntu latest. So this is a Linux-based machine based on Ubuntu. What else? That you can compile your code up. This means that it's running on a machine that's not managed by you. You can also specify Windows. It's the same similar stuff. It's not a machine that's managed by you, but by Microsoft. And you specify it by selecting or specifying the Windows-latest.
So one thing on that, Ryan, if you use normal PowerShell, you wouldn't be able to do that on an Ubuntu machine, right?
Yeah, so they have PowerShell core enabled or installed on the pipeline machine. So in this way, you have the ability to use the PowerShell core. But I have to add a specific note to that, because you need to take this into account when writing your PowerShell code. Because on PowerShell core, not all the syntax are available, and also running on a Linux-based machine. Some stuff like, for example, I think it's also compressing an archive is not available on PowerShell core.
Yeah, and you have to, of course, take into account the way that the paths are specified, which is different in
Exactly.
Linux compared to Windows.
It's the different, the other slashes, not the backslash, but the forward slash. Yeah. An important thing with specifying the pool, you also have the ability to select your private pool, and then you can just install the DevOps agents on your own managed machine, and that you can leverage at least in Azure DevOps. So if you have like security reasons or other any reasons to use a specific or an own DevOps machine, you can also do that. Now let's go to the first step. So within Azure DevOps, you specify steps, and you can also add multiple stages, but I'm not going to explain all these possibilities from the pipelines. So I really can recommend to go to the Microsoft documentation if you want to know more about the pipelines syntax. But in this case, we have specified steps and using a single task. So here we have selected the PowerShell task. So we're going to run a PowerShell script. Now also for display purposes, I created the display name. So we're going to compile the Citrix Microapps. And this requires, so PowerShell task requires an input, in this case, a file path, where we're going to specify the compile microapp PowerShell script that Eltjo explained.
And you
now,
created.
Yeah. Now this is specified in the sources directory. As in pipeline is when a pipeline is started, it will always check out the repository. So all files are available that is in a repository within the default source directory. So therefore, we specify the source directory where the file is going to be located on that specific machine where it's going to be running. Now, in this case, the script that I've created contains two parameters, the path, and the path is the location where the microapps are located, which is in our GitHub or in the Git repository under the folder microapps. And we're going to create the files towards the destination path, which is going to be our artifact staging directory. So this is within the Azure DevOps agent, a dedicated folder for staging files, so it can be eventually published as an artifact. Easy peasy, right? So let's go to the next step, and the final step is publishing the artifact. So we want to use this specific map file and publish it so we can leverage in a separate stage for releasing it towards Citrix Cloud. So we need to make sure it's also available, and this is done by publishing. So again, we have the default task layout. In this case, we have the publish path. So we're going to publish everything within the artifact staging directory where we just put in the microapp that we compile. We're going to specify a name. So this is a name that you can specify. In this case, I have selected microapps, and it's going to be in the location container. Now, Azure DevOps has two possibilities, I think, so top of my head. You can specify share location, so file share, or you can use the storage within Azure DevOps, which is called container. And so then the files will be stored in Azure DevOps. Now, once you have created and run this specific pipeline, you will see that once the compile is successful, as shown in the green check mark, you will see when you open it, there's a published artifact there in the highlighted part. So we're going to take a look in that. You will see that it contains a specific artifact of this release containing the microapp. And it's just what we need for our next step, which is from build to release.
So now that we know how to export integration microapps, of course, we also need a way to import them back into the system. And this we can also do in two ways. Let's start by looking at the GUI. We can use the GUI to import a previously configured integration. And if you click that, due to some security constraints, some information was omitted when we exported the microapp and the integration. So if you import them back in, you need to add the missing information back in. In this case, it is specifically focused on the client ID and the client secret, which makes sense, right? This isn't information that you want in your export file. So you have to put the information back in, which is pretty darn easy when you use the GUI. So again, we can also leverage the Citrix Microapps APIs to import the integration and the microapps back into the system. To do that in code, we can use the import bundle API. But here's where things start to look a little bit messy. With this API, we need, among other things, to specify a configuration file in JSON with the missing information. The problem is, however, that Citrix does specify a sample configuration, as you can see here in purple, but they don't mention anywhere what options we have to build it up. For instance, it says here that you can use the type GWSC, but that's the only thing they specify. They don't specify anything else on the other options that we have available. So that brings us to another thing. We need to post a form. And to post a form, which was something we found out the hard way, you need at least PowerShell version 6.1. Instead of the default 5 version that is installed to Windows 10. And it took us quite a while to figure that out, by the way.
Yeah, so this applies really to towards PowerShell. So we use PowerShell as our primary scripting language to do all these steps. And in this case, the form parameter is just added in 6.1. So by default on Windows 10, you have 5 point something installed.
Yeah, 5.1, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so you need to upgrade at least your PowerShell version towards this version or higher.
Yeah. So the problem with the sample configuration file that Citrix provided, we couldn't figure out what parameters we needed to import the integration back in. And that means that we couldn't successfully import it into integration from the API, unfortunately. Citrix was, however, very nice and very kind to give us some more details on what we did wrong. And the error was unable to parse the JSON input. Please check if the input is proper and well-formed JSON. Well, we know that the input was well-formed JSON, but we have no idea what we have to put in here. So
what we have,
there.
Yeah, what we have to understand, at least from the configuration file and comparing it towards the form that you need to fill in once importing the microapp, there was specifying like basic authentication. We know we need OAuth 2 authentication, but we don't know the exact format, how to put it in the config file.
Or the wording.
And this breaks at least our dream for integrating or releasing our microapp.
Yeah.
It's actually
Crash
a big
and burn.
bummer. Yeah. But for example's sake, let's continue and let's say, okay, we have like a script that we can release our the microapps. How will you integrate this in a separate pipeline? Now, this is again as similar as the previous one. I created a YAML file which shows a dedicated release pipeline. Again, this is also triggered on the master. I have to admit that you have to trigger it at least on the artifact. So once the build is released and successful, and the artifact is available, then this should be triggered. But for demo purposes, I didn't adjust that. But the important thing is here, we need that specific artifact that's released in a separate build in this pipeline. And this is the step how you specify it. So using the visual editor in the Azure DevOps GUI, you can just specify and click which release you want, because you also need to specify your project ID and all kinds of information. Please just use the visual assistants. It will help you a lot.
And with just like with the build pipeline, if you click it in the GUI, it'll generate the YAML file, in this case the release YAML file for you, right?
Yes. What it will do when you click it, it will just insert where your cursor is located. So you also
Okay.
need to ensure that you put your cursor on the right location, because otherwise it will be somewhere in the middle. But it will inject the part. Yes, you're fully correct. You can fill in all the details, click add, and it will be added.
Awesome.
So we have the artifact, which is basically the map files, and then we can continue and use a script that we didn't create yet, but hopefully we're going to create it in the near future. But that will then publish towards the Microapp, the production environment or the test environment, depending on the stage you're in.
Yeah, and on that, if there's anyone who was able to create an import script for the Microapps, please reach out to us, because we are really curious on how you did that.
Yeah, I think it's not possible yet, but it's that's my perspective. But please show us otherwise.
Yep, prove us wrong.
Yeah, so let's wrap up, because I think we are almost on our time limit.
Yep.
So there's a couple things for you as an attendee. And the first one, believe in code. Now, for developers, this makes sense, right? Code is the thing you do all day, every day, probably also in the weekends. But for people like us, more in the consulting type, it's not the basic. So, but you need to understand the world is changing towards code. So you need to also start believing in code and accept that it's going to be part of our lives. Now, another important factor is using Git, and especially extracting the microapps, and not the map files, but extracting the map files towards a Git version or in Git. So you need to make sure that you can at least properly version your microapps, which is important. And this is the way for maintaining your microapps and adding and updating it. And as we have learned, unfortunately, we cannot complete the entire pipeline, but you can at least prepare for the pipelines and maybe update it by hand for now. It's not the recommended way to do it, but until Citrix have fixed all the our feedback points, then we can at least leverage the pipelines. But of course, also you as an organization or as a person needs to be familiar with the pipelines, and you can already prepare for that.
Yeah, and talk about fixing bugs. We also have some next steps for Citrix. First of all, we really need these bugs squashed. We need to export microapps, and when we export microapps, we need to have a metadata.json which is filled with correct information, because otherwise we cannot use the import. On the other hand, we also need more APIs. So we saw that we have APIs to export and to import microapps, but we have no APIs to work with existing microapps. We have no way of deleting microapps, and we have no way of updating existing microapps if we want to.
Interesting fact. Sorry to interrupt you, Eltjo, but because we didn't successfully import a microapp using the API, we don't know the expected behavior when importing. But we do know when you import an existing microapp using the GUI, it will add an identifier by #2.
Oh, yeah.
And so we don't know yet if you add or import the microapp in an environment where it's already listed, it probably will be added with an increment number.
Yeah.
So therefore, we also need more APIs to have more control over the microapps.
Yeah. And we also need a lot more documentation on the APIs. As we showed you, the sample configuration file is a step towards the right way, but we need to have that specified because we have no idea what to expect. And that goes for other parts of the documentation as well. In parts, it is really lacking. And lastly, and that's one I'll leave for Ryan because it was his suggestion.
Yeah, so what I've noticed that is a little bit strange. You see that Citrix is really focusing on getting developers into the microapps and creating all new microapps and integrations, but they don't provide the proper tooling in the right order towards the for the developers. So in this case, I would really like to have a visual editor, like for example, an integration in Visual Studio, where I can create and design my micro apps offline and also validate it offline, and then using Git for all the versioning stuff to commit it and get it towards the production. So we, at this point, we don't see that although Citrix is focusing on developers, the developer method is not really applied towards microapps, which is really strange. So I really hope that.
Actually.
Sorry?
Which is a shame, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And I think by enabling the proper tooling, you can also enable more and more developers creating more intelligent integrations, because I really know that you guys are really smart to create excellent integrations. Now, that's it. Firstly, it ended a little bit of a bummer, but we hope that in the near future it's going to be great. But I hope this was kind of informative for you guys, and I hope you have at least learned something from this presentation. So if you have any questions, we're still hanging out in the, I think it's in the Slack Q&A channel,
yep,
or in other communication channel that we will be. Otherwise, you have our details here listed to reach out, and we're happy to help you guys further. Thank you, guys. Have a great Citrix Converge, and stay safe, of course.
Take care, guys. See you later.